Part 18 of Thorstein of the Mere by W.G. Collingwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. Unbidden Guests. But what about Asdis all this while? She was never the worse off, whatever happened. She was too wise to spoil her looks with weeping, and too pretty to sit long at Asmunderley, waiting for a new husband. She lighted on her feet like a cat wherever she fell, and before many months was purring by another fireside with the cream of the milk to lap. But as she blinked in the fire glow, she was only watching her mouse. The land was not so bare of people as it had been 20 winters since. Bit by bit as the days went on, the dales were cleared and inhabited. From the low country, one after another went up to take land among the fells, for the Northmen could never abide close quarters. They hated towns and loved a free life, a spot to themselves with elbow room, a seat on a howe overlooking broad fields and fell pastures, with the smoke of the next neighbour's hall rising far away through the green wood. It was one thing to have good friends within hail and call, but another to be thrust among folk in one of those stinking swine sties, said they, where the Saxons herded. And so their biggings crept up from the shore of Leven and Duddon, and from nook to nook the house reek rose, like bale fires lighted to tell the world that this Lakeland was the land-take of the Northmen. Therefore all the coming and going of Thorstein could not fail to be spied, and the tale sped from mouth to mouth, time and again, and lost little in its travels. In a while it came to Dame Asdis, where she sat with black anger in her heart against Thorstein, and against the wild she-wolf of the fells who had stolen him out of her arms. And in all this she blamed herself never one whit, and folk came to look on her as a fair woman with great wrongs to avenge. In a time of quiet, when ill men are aweary of peace, and stirring men hanker after the adventures of old days, no great work was needed to egg on rough fellows to the job she had on hand. A gang of lads and louts was drawn together, and some silly vow got out of them that they would rid the land of the wood-biders, and all as if it had been some great deed. Now the island was but very little known to the North folk at the back of the fells, but one thing they knew, and this was that they could not come at it without boats, and if they stayed boat building they would be spied and foreset. But, said Asdis, wait until the apple drops. Why build a boat to cross a bridge? At which they gaped. But she bade them watch the birds and the bushes, for that third winter began to be a hard winter. The swallows went early, and the wild swans came in flocks from the north. Choups and hollyberries reddened the hedges, and after Yule the fells were creamed over and the becks dwindled. As the days lengthened, so the cold strengthened, until even the sunny shores of Leven and Duddon were frozen fast. And when a high tide came, it burst the flow, and left the sands and mosses strewn for many a mile with huge blocks and tables of ice, piled one upon another like peats to dry. Then Asdis rubbed her hands and said, Now, lads, your bridge will be built. So they set out and away through the snowy woods, until they came to the waterside of Thorstein Mere, and there was a sight. Still as death the white fells stood around. Still as death the lake spread white and black, white where the snow hid it, and black in great reaches that could hardly be known from standing water, but that its soft ripples stirred not, and the picture of wood and fell lay upon them clearer and quieter than the shapes in a tarn on a summer day, for all the north winds blowing. The only thing that moved was a wreath of smoke on the fell side over against them, and the likeness of the same wreath in the glassy field below. And where the two wreaths met was a crag standing up from the flat, an island no longer. They adventured from the snowy shore, hardly knowing when they were on land and when on lake, until suddenly beneath their feet deep down they saw the stones lying at the bottom, clear in the sunlight, through the wonderful floor, such as the floor of heaven may be to them that walk upon it and look down upon us thence. Slowly now and warily the men went, for the ice was smooth and slape, and if it was roughened at all, it was not with waves, but as if stars and arrowheads of crystal had been inlaid in glass, like the silver a smith inlays in steel. Then, as they walked, there arose a strange turmoil in the stillness. Far and wide the ice began to crack and settle, with groanings and thunderings that roared and muttered from shore to shore. Across the black clear deep there flew white ragged lightnings on either hand, before and behind, as when one watches a thunderstorm in the valley beneath a lofty mountain. Then a great crack flitted screaming right under their feet, and half the company turned and scattered, crying out there was witch-work in it, and they were lost. But as they staggered and slid and fell, others cursed them for fools, and kicked them up again, and egged them on, showing them how to set feet together, and shove themselves along with their spears thrust hard behind them upon the ice. And so they won a mile or so to the island. But before they were half-way over, the smoke shot up into a thick cloud, and flames flickered. And over the waste of white and black above the moaning and groaning of the ice field arose the deep note of a horn, stifled and quivering at first, and strengthening into a hollow peal that suddenly stayed. As suddenly it was answered from the fell, and then again from the beacon hill behind, and then again far up the lake, until the sky was ringing with it. They stood in amaze to listen, and the flame blazed higher, and the smoke rolled in coils brown against the white moorland. Again the war horn pealed, and the answers came, and when the last had died away, another answer, over and above the echoes, a faint clang far down the crake. And then there was only the groaning of the ice to hear, and the island, when they came to it, was nothing but a snowy rock, untenanted for aught they could see, and lifeless but for the great fire. All around the brink the slape ice shelved away by the settling of the lake, so that footing was bad to get. The rock went down sheer into the smooth floor, grey and bare beneath, and heaped with pillowy snow above, from which hung fringes of icicles, like teeth of a dragon in northern deeps. They scrambled up the shelving slide, and grasped at the rocks to break away the icicles and beat down the snow for handhold and foothold. But as they strove up the lower rocks, half smothered with the mealy drift, two heads came out upon the top of the crag, and two great stones rolled among them, and those they fell upon cried but once. Then began a storm of stones from above, to which they could make no reply, for the defenders were hidden behind the highest ridge, and safe from shot. Even if the attackers could make a shift to use bow and dart, and that they could seldom in their eagerness to win upward, and in their unsteady footing, their weapons only rattled down among them again from the ice-bound rock. And so this went on for a while, until many had been maimed, and some killed outright. The nearer they got, the steeper and more dangerous were the battlements of that castle built without hands. A long wall high enough and steep enough to be difficult any day, but hopeless in this snow and frost, with the great stones plunging down, well aimed from above. They drew off to the open and held council. In a while they broke into two bands, and went round the island to try for scaling spots, and to break in on both hands at once. Now the ends of the island are less brant than its sides, for there is a way up between the ridges both to north and south. But nobody who meant to hold the place would fail to stop those doors with some stockading at least, if not a good stone wall. And so they were brought to a standstill here as heretofore. The north end was not only well blocked, but the rocks there are stiff and steep for this work, and of the two defenders, one followed each company round about, never leaving them alone, what with stones, what with hand-strokes when they tried the wooden palings. And if fire was hot within the hold, it was all frost without, and never a spark to set the doors alight. So now they met together at the south end, where the twin harbour lies between the Calf and Crag. They began to swarm up a buttress that makes a narrow ladder to the top, easy enough to climb if it were not for the ice that sheeted it, and for the rough welcome that awaited the first man on the sharp and perilous crest. By this the far-away fells stood rosy red and dim around. The sky was like fire behind Beacon Fell, and the cold floor of ice seemed to be all one lake of blood. The bale on the crag reeked and roared, and out of the smoke came a sword that lopped the first comer like a bough, and sent him rolling down the unbroken rock for many an ell. Then they were aware of the wood-biders standing over them, each with a weapon. They took heart and shuffled up the harder, shouting curses, and what they would do when they won to the top. But the next comer rolled into the bay with his brains knocked out. That was the doing of a big stick that swung round and about in the hands of Raniach. "Well done, lass," shouted Thorstein, who kept his distance from her, however. "It's not for nothing she's a giant's daughter," he laughed, for he was warming to the work. But then the children waked behind them, stirred by the noise, and they screamed. Raniach was scared lest some of the rascals had got in the back way, and she flew to seek them. The carles below set up a jeer, and 3 or 4 flung in at once. One was down, and another was down, but Thorstein's sword bent, and as he kneeled on it to straighten it, the others were at him. They had him on his back, and a stroke would have done their job, but out came Raniach with such a swinging bat of her club on the one of them as broke his backbone like a rotten stick, and she gripped the other by the throat and hauled him off. She lugged and tugged and fairly lifted him off his feet and bundled him over the edge among his fellows. Up springs Thorstein with a great shout, and she beside him, and every mother's son that could stir a limb scattered off the edge in a flock. The weight of them all coming down together broke the ice where it was rotten from the warmth of the flat rock that caught and kept the morning sun, and they went into the hole like corn into the miller's hopper. It was deep there. The rock goes down at once into the lake, and rises again in ugly teeth, bound to cut a swimmer's knees, let alone the edges of the broken ice. He with the lopped arm, their leader in the assault, after a few wild strokes went down in a red spot. The rest struggled out to the nearest shore, and shouted themselves hoarse with their anger. Thorstein and Raniach went up to look at the man whose back was broken. He cried for water, and she gave him to drink. Thorstein stood over him, fierce and stern. "Who sent thee, man?" he said, but they got nothing out of him, and in a while he died. And then, when all was over, Raniach burst into a blurt of weeping. "What, lass? What, lass?" said Thorstein, as she shook and sobbed in his arms. "Hold up, my little one. All's right now. I warrant we see no more of them. There's not a scratch on thee, and I am none the worse but for a bruise or two. What's there to greet for?" "It's not that," she sobbed. "Here then, take the barn. Hark how he is crying on his mother." Then, as the sobs shook her and the baby at her breast, said Thorstein, staring at them and biting a twig, "Eh, queer things women are. Aye, and," says he, "there's women and women." And so Asdis goes out of the story. When the stars were shining, they had more guests, not unbidden, though late to the play. "Kinsman," said Hundi, as he panted and caught his breath between draughts of milk in the cot on the island. "Kinsman, no more of this. To the Althing thou goest this midsummer, if I drag thee yonder by the scruff of the neck, and—" "Aye, goes he," said the half-score of men that had come hot-foot from Lowick. "Never saw I woman more scared than Halldora when thy horn sounded." "Scared was she," said one of them, "but for a scare, oh boys, the master capped all. Snail, says I, as I pelted after him. Hare, says I. Hundi Harefoot's the word." Hundi caught him by the hand, laughing. "A forfeit," he cried, "to fasten the name." But Thorstein, my man, get thy peace and let us share it. Life is not worth living with this horn blowing to look for." So when midsummer was come, Thorstein set forth alone, sorely as Raniach grudged his leaving her. She said it was for no good he was going, but he kissed her and said she should be mistress of Blawith before the summer was out. "That may be," she said, "but never so happy as here." Chapter 47 The Host of Weird. Thorstein travelled over the fells to the waterhead of the great lake we call Windermere, meaning to stay there for the night, and so to come upon the Althing when folk were at their meeting about midday. But when he was at the door of the Welshmen's cots in that old ruin of the Romans, there was a great noise within, and he spied a many Northmen sitting there at drink, and among them some faces he knew and misliked. They too were on their way to Legbathwaite, and no sooner did he darken the door, but they leapt up and ran at him. He had no mind to redden his hands with them, just when he was going to sue for his peace, and away he went, out of the great road and into the woods again. This was a part he knew but little, and yet he found a track that led him up a steep dell and over a hause where there was a wonderful big stone, like a kirk, by the wayside, with high fells running up on either hand. Before him lay the great deep valley, reaching away northward, and all its forests and crags purple and golden in the summer afternoon. Here and there was a gleam of water, and far in the distance smoke rising, as if from the houses of men. The path led onward and downward, rough and steep. He followed it for a good while, and came to a tarn, which afterwards the Northmen called Brotherwater, from the ancient road that passed by. Then he was on the floor of the valley, with the steep heights all around and above, and it was but an hour or so to the village of Patrickdale. This was another of those few spots in the fell country where people were found before the Northmen came into Lakeland. The dwellers were mostly like the rougher sort of fell folk, and their cots were of the poorest, scattered and buried in the wood. And yet they had a church in their midst, if it were no more than a cell, where a kind of hermit priest lived. And in the one little chamber slept upon the ground, and ate his crust, and performed the holy service, with nothing but a rough stone for his altar, and another for his pillow. Thorstein sat down weary and hungered at the church door, and knocked upon it. Presently in the quiet village there was a barking of dogs that echoed from crag to crag around, and then the church door opened, and the priest came out with a thumping big stick upheld in one hand, while he unbarred the iron-hasped door with the other. Thorstein bade him have peace, for it was a Christian and a wayfarer who begged for alms. He spoke in the fell folk's tongue, reckoning that whether the priest were English or Irish, he must speak so in his cracks with the country folk hereabouts. So the priest let him into the church, and from an ark brought out a bowl of sour milk and a cake of rye bread. "Maybe now," said Thorstein, "this is all thou hast." "All I have here," said the priest, "but there are good neighbours." So Thorstein drank the milk at a draught, and ate the cake in 2 mouthfuls. "I am no stranger in these parts," said he, "but I never was here before." "Like enough not," said the priest. "We call this St. Patrick's Church, for on this spot many a lifetime back the glorious and blessed Patrick preached, and in the well hard by christened both men and women that heard him. And here in this desert, unworthy as I am, I strive to keep the lamp alight, as those that watch for their Lord." They talked together a while, for the priest seemed right glad of a friendly face other than those of his rough flock. Goats he called them, for lambs they be not indeed, but very mountain goats. "And yet God forgive me for saying an ill word of them," added he, "for I mind me of the days when I was in the world. There was as much hardness of heart and stiff-neckedness among our townsfolk yonder at Dacre." But now there was a noise without, and the dogs barking again. More than that, eager voices. Out stepped the priest to hear what the news might be, bidding Thorstein stay where he was, or he would not answer for him. There was a couple of men, Fighting men of Domhnairs they seemed by their weapons, but no great champions by their faces. Around them a knot of rough villagers, half clothed in skins and shaggy headed with staves in their hands. They all talked long and loud. Thorstein could just hear something about an army and flight and slaughter, but he deemed it wise to do as the priest bade him, lest he should be miskenned and mauled by that rabble. "Lord help us," said the priest, coming back into the church. "God and all blessed saints protect us. Ill tidings, young man, awful tidings. But as the mountains stand round about Jerusalem, even so the Lord stands round us who fear him." Then between prayers and sighs he told the news. These were 2 men of the Dale who had gone to fight in Domhnaill's army, called out but lately. It seems that Edmund the English king had been warring in the north, against Domhnaill's people in Strathclyde and against the Vikings in Galloway, and having wasted far and wide, he was entered into Cumberland, where Domhnaill, though he had fled from place to place, thought to make another stand, and so had called out every man he could levy. But still he got the worst of it, and fled before the Saxons. And no wonder, for with the Saxons there were Malcolm king of Scots, and a host of his, and Llewelyn of Wales with his men, a terrible great multitude. Last night they lay at Penrith, and Domhnaill was pressing his men forward towards the fell country, hoping either to escape into the mountain fastnesses, or to entangle his enemies in some straight pass among rocks and swamps, and so destroy them. But before these men fled from his army, it had been given out that he aimed at the mountain road to the city of Helvellyn. "What?" cried Thorstein. "Beside our Northmen's meeting place? Aye, father, though I am a Christian, I am a Northman born, and neither Dane nor Saxon. Tell me, O man, tell me how I may come to them and give them warning. Is there a way over yon crags? It cannot be far, and yet the rocks stand up like walls of heaven." The priest took him to the door and pointed out a deep dale that runs up into the fells. Grisdale we call it now. When he was at the head of that dale he would find a tarn. Then he was to take the valley to his right hand, and it would bring him to the hause above the city of Helvellyn. "But," said he, "it is trackless forest, none rougher in our mountains, and it teems with wild swine. If it were for a boar hunt with a party of stout fellows, no place could be fitter, but for a lone traveller at speed and a stranger, I doubt the end of the journey might be nearer than its goal." "Path or no path, boars or no boars," cried Thorstein, running back into the church for his weapons, "I must try it, and that hastily." "Stay," said the priest, "there is another way, if thou canst climb the rocks like a wild cat, and keep a cool head while the eagles scream around thee. I know this only by report, but men have climbed above the woods where all is open grass or naked rock, and so across over Helvellyn. They say it is a fearful place, no otherwise than when one mounts a ladder against a castle wall, but that this is as terrible in its loftiness and horror beyond any high tower or deep sea crag, and the night is at hand." "The night," said Thorstein, "is fair, and never wholly dark at this season. As for crags and the danger of the fells, I have fared through a many before now. Point me out the way, father." It was the clear gloaming of summer midnight when he had forced his way through the woods that clothed the valley side, and that crept up the crags like moss on a stone. He was on Striding Edge. Forest and fell around him were black, a tossing surge of darkness, in which gleamed ugly and strange the great lake that reached away into distance of slaty gloom. On the ridge there was light from the north, a brown light, no more than enough to see footing and handhold, but when his foot slipped and a great stone rolled from under it, there was a crash and a roar that raised the echoes all round the cove, as the stone whirled and leapt towards the round tarn that he could hardly discern in the blackness. How far below he could not reckon, and on the other hand it was no less steep. Pinnacles of rock stood up along the abyss, and in front a great mass, a wall it seemed in the uncertain gloom, unapproachable. With the falling stones the eagles were roused, and sailed screaming about him, so that he clung to the ridge and drew his sword. Then he came to a place where the rock fell away into darkness, and he sat doubting the priest's guidance, and scanning the black wall that rose overhead before him, for he was weary by now, and began to be faint with hunger. He cast overboard his shield that he had carried so far, and it fell down the rock but a little way, and then caught. He followed it and found it, and then scrambled up the wall, which turned out to be no more than a scree slope, though it was one of the stiffest. From Helvellyn top he saw the arch of light in the north again, sunset and dawn in one, streaked with black bars of cloud. But underneath them, strong against the meshes of faint daffodil colour and the lowest band of dusky red, stood out the lines of Skiddaw and Blencathra, the shapes he knew right well of old, and welcomed joyfully. He ran along the brown and rounded grassy summit, forgetting his weariness, until Thirlmere gleamed beneath him, the winding lake with its steep shores, and the crags where he had first met Alwyn and Domhnaill. Then how high that mountain eyrie of theirs had seemed, but now it was nought but a heave in the dark land that was spread out before him like an embroidered garment cast upon the floor. Then as he went forward, wary of the swamps that lie among the grass of those great mountain backs, he saw a man come up on the moorland, but from some point farther north, and run as he had run across toward Thirlmere. "He'll be another of the fleers," said Thorstein to himself. "He is bound for the Northmen's camp like me," and he shouted and tried to overtake him, but in vain. Then came up 2 or 3 others. They were dimly seen and grey in that twilight, but he could make them out enough to know that they carried weapons and fled in haste. He shouted again, but no answer. Then more followed, and he could see that among the newcomers were pursuers as well as pursued. And now one fell and was killed outright before his eyes. But there was no sound of shouting, and as he ran toward them, he seemed to come no nearer, whether it was that the twilight put him out of his reckoning, or what. And then came a flock of men, marching forward with banner and spear, aye, and horses among them, and chariots on the bare mountain top, with pathless crags behind and in front, where no army could have marched in order, nor waggon have gone upon wheels. But still they crossed over, a very great multitude, under the broken light that held his eyes fixed to northward. He stayed running and listened. The waterfalls roared beneath, but not a sound was there of living men, neither tramp nor shout, and still they passed. Terror was upon him now, and his knees shook. He looked behind him, and out of the deep blackness a few great stars shone, and around was the moorland with its strange forms, and he knew not what else, crowding upon him. With a cry he fled down the grassy slope. It fell away steeper and steeper. He stumbled among the hidden stones, but he could not stay his feet. And down he rolled from rock to rock into the thunder of Helvellyn Gill. End of Part 18. Part 19 of Thorstein of the Mere by W.G. Collingwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48. The Storm of the Lawberg. At Legberthwaite the morning was wild. The wind had risen in the night and brought rain. The clouds were low, raking along the fell sides, and one could hardly see the crags across the valley for greyness. The Althing was not yet hallowed, for the Northmen were not met together. Some early comers had arrived and spent the night in their booths, rough hut walls, unroofed, put up of old to serve for lodging at these summer meetings, and covered, when the time was, with tent cloths cast over them. A group of elder men sat talking in the rain, others were setting up the bounds of the doom ring, driving in the posts with pick and mallet, and cutting hazel poles in the copse hard by to lay across from stake to stake. Others were repairing the winter's damage to the turf seats within the ring, where the chiefs and the jurymen were to sit. Down from Helvellyn side, through the driving rain, crept a battered man, slowly working his way among the boulders of the slope. He dragged himself up to the group of elders, and they saw that he was newly wounded, and fordone with toil and travel. Then said one, "This is Thorstein Sweinson of the Mere, he that slew his brother. Away, fellow, the place is not hallowed yet. There's no peace to be got now for such as thee." Said another, "Let be. The wood-bider is not here for nought, and maybe has a story to tell." But he gaped upon them and could not speak, so they gave him to drink. "Thanks, friend," he said. "Neighbours, do with me as you will, but hear me. Domhnaill is fleeing before the Saxons. He is upon us even now. Last night I saw 2 of his men. They had fled to their home in the fells. They said that Edmund and the English king was at Domhnaill's heels, and with him Malcolm the Scot, and Llewellyn of Wales with a great multitude. Domhnaill was for leading them hither, to entrap them if he could, or to escape into the mountains. I have fled night long over yon high fells to bring the news, and I have seen them. On the top of the mountains I saw the host pursuing and pursued. Whether it was a vision I cannot tell, but the tidings are truth." "Here be fine dreams," said the first speaker, "and midsummer madness. Dreams or no dreams, the man is spent with travel and battered, and he gives his head into our hands for the sake of the tidings. We shall soon see whether they be true. Meanwhile, my lad, come into my booth and be fed." Thorstein had hardly brought hand to mouth when there was a stir without, and the foremost flyers of Domhnaill's army came by. They were the guard of the king's wife and children, and a troop of pack horses with them, heavily laden, maybe with treasure. They made no stay but for a hasty word, and away toward the city of Helvellyn. The Northmen, taking short counsel together, agreed to draw out of their booths and to make a stand upon the Thing Mount, and so abide what might happen. Why they should thus meddle, when they might have escaped with the foremost flyers, or easily hidden in the woods, who can say, except that they were bred fighting men, and thought scorn to leave their own Thingstead without so much as a stroke. So there in battle array they stood on their mound, where the 4 dales met, and the great crags around. Over against them the path crept by the skirts of the fells, on this side the Greta, and on that Helvellyn beck, and the clouds flying low, and the rain driving. Out of the mist came the flyers, horse galloping and foot running, whoever was sound and unwounded outpacing his fellows as they streamed up the road and into the mist again. Then came the wearied men, some of them wounded, and some scant of breath and half blind with toil and with watching under arms, pushing and pressing along the narrow path. Here and there one falling with a groan and kicked out of the way into the river, or screaming as the horses stamped the life out of him. And so they swept past, while the Northmen cried to them across the dale to turn and stand by their friends. Then there was a pause, and the sound of the pursuers shouting along the vale of St. John, and presently their vanguard was seen pressing along the road. Welsh they were of Llewellyn's company, to whom the foremost place had been given in this enterprise, because they were mountain men, and led where the Lowlanders, with all the fire of the chase, sometimes held back from following. When they came to the place where they could see the Northmen in array on the How, they were brought to a standstill, and fresh comers behind them crowded at their rear, like the wreckage of a streaming flood when one great bough is held fast at a force head. Then they crossed the flat field and stood on the bank of Helvellyn beck, and cried to the Northmen to come down and yield themselves. But the Northmen shouted in answer, and gave them a flight of spears, and when the spears were spent, stones and the turf of the Thing seats, and everything that was handy. Soon the Welshmen, seeing how few they had to deal with, and how many of their own men had come up by this time, took heart and rushed up the bank shoulder to shoulder. but along the bank top it was shield to shield, and a line of whirling blades, and down the wave rolled again. By this time the main army was coming up, and the cry was for bowmen, for in those days it was not as it was in later times, when every English foot soldier carried his long bow. Spear to throw and axe to hew with were their main weapons. The Welsh stood aside, and a file of archers passed through the host, and formed in a line on the Thingfield, while the rest ransacked the booths. Together the bowmen drew their bows, and at a shout of command to let fly, the Northmen fell flat under their shields, and the flight of arrows hurtled over them. But while this was going forward, behind the line of archers, other companies crept this way and that, and through the cover of the wood on Great Howe other bowmen climbed up to take advantage of the higher ground, and to get the Northmen below them, and soon there was a rattling on shield and helm and coat of mail. When the enemy saw that they were beginning to be discomfited, spears were levelled, and up they rushed in a thick throng on all sides at once, man pressing man from behind, so that there was no turning nor fleeing. Down went the first comers all round the line of red blades, but the shield that Thorstein had carried and lost, and saved again, was burst through, and a broken shaft left in it, and the strap was riven. He took it in both hands and hurled it edgewise, and shouted when it caught a big fellow in the teeth, and drove him backwards into the thick of the crowd below. "Well thrown, Woodbider," said his next neighbour. "I'll be thy shield man this home gang," and he caught a stroke on his target, and Thorstein leapt out from behind him and cut down the man who had given it. So it was hand to hand and sword to spear for a while over the ring of fallen bodies, but the Northmen shook them off and thrust them down the brink again. Then one upon the Thingstead began to sing, and then another, in staves of verse that seemed to set their fellows' hearts on fire. They shouted at their foes, giving them every ill name and stinging jest that might prick them to a new attack, but the only answer was the hail of arrows from above, and if the rain washed the Northmen white, there was red enough running to need it. Hardly one among them but had some hurt. Thorstein, who was no whole man to start with, and ill clad for this play, was the worse for more than a scratch. "Neighbours," said he, "why are we standing still to be shot down like deer?" Then forth he leapt and down the slope, hewing right and left, and leaving a lane through the crowd. His friends followed close in a band, and the enemy drew back before them and closed behind them. The Northmen were like a wild beast in a net. "Look you there," said Thorstein, holding out a bladeless hilt. "Was ever such rotten iron?" "It has done a day's work," said his friend with the shield. "Nay, not a forenoon's." He sat down upon a stone. His friend took him under the shoulder to lift him on. "We shall win through yet," said he, but Thorstein fell over on the red grass. "Let be," said the elder, who had known him at the first. "He has got his peace. Forward all!" Chapter 49 Dunmail Rise. King Edmund stood upon the brink of Thirlmere and scanned the shore on either side. His enemies had vanished, as if by art magic. There lay the path, running down to the ford, and up again on the farther side, and it could be traced winding under the terrible crags whose tops were lost in clouds, and away into huge headlands and shaggy promontories plunging into the water, one beyond another, until they faded afar in the rain and mist. On this hand King Malcolm, and on that hand King Llewelyn, were instant to go forward and follow the road, but the Lowland king, brave as he was in a fight, and bold in council, hung back from the attempt, and from following unseen foes into unknown fastnesses. While they talked, across the wath came 2 or 3 men, gaunt and red-bearded and clothed in skins. They waved their hands above their heads, as if to signify that they came in peace, and the king bade bring them before him. At their first words, "King," said Malcolm, "these are folk of mine, or should be, for it is our tongue they have. Let me be interpreter." Then the fell folk told the kings that Domhnaill and his men were lurking in the woods, ready to roll rocks upon their enemies, but they could show the Saxons how to get the better of the ambush. Asked by what device, they said that fell climbers could reach the top of the brow under which Domhnaill lay, and once there, a few men could roll rocks on him, as he had meant to roll rocks upon the Saxons, and then the main army could pursue them along the road, which was no worse than that by which they had come. "And a good counsel it is, king," said Malcolm, when he had interpreted, "and one that we use often in our mountain warfare. Give the business into my hand, and you shall see them swarm out of the woods like ants out of a stirred ant-hill." "But what faith can we put in the word of these savages?" asked Eadmund. They said proudly that it was so as they had spoken, and they were at the hand of the kings to reward or to slay. "And beside that," said one of them with a scowl, "we have an old grudge of our own to settle with Domhnaill." So the army moved over the wath, and the main body halted on the road, ready for the chase when the game was beaten out of cover. Malcolm, with a band of mountain men, guided by the red folk, climbed the brow of Armboth fell, and when they were at the top, set to work heaving rocks over the edge. There was a crashing among trees, and shouts and shrieks, and presently men were beheld fleeing down the screes among the woods, and the great stones whirling down after them. Such as got away streamed out into the road, and fled along it up and down, like worms out of a dunghill when it is beaten to get baits. Then the trumpets were blown that should signal to the men above to leave their work, and forth marched the army in hot pursuit, along the path and along the low foreshore of the lake, and then mounting over the crags where they were high, and descending again among rocks and cliffs and wildwood that overhung the length of the lake. And at last they looked down upon the city of Helvellyn. Here for a while they were brought to a stand. The walls of great stones and the swampy flats on one side of it threatened to hold them longer than they liked. The day was wearing, and if the nut were cracked, the kernel was not eaten yet. So they took up their stand on the high ground between the city and the fell, and the trumpets sounded an assault. Then there was shouting and a terrible cry that rose to Helvellyn top, as the Saxons clambered up the rugged wall in throngs, and leapt over, bearing down the defenders and slaughtering all before them. Domhnaill's wife and his 2 children were taken, but for the rest it was kill and slay, as men ransacked the rude cots within the walls for their enemies, and hewed them down where they found them. But while all this was going forward, a band of men was spied making away along the fell side. They had escaped by the farther gate and along the road, and the freshest of the Saxons who were still outside the walls, and the fleetest of their horsemen were sent in pursuit. But the road was rugged and difficult as ever, and if they came up with one party and brought it to bay, it was but to waste time, and the rest had the better start of them. And so the battle went on, at every beck to be forded and every rock to be passed, and especially where the great tongue of land at the foot of the steel fell stands across the valley like a twin wall of huge earthworks cast up by giants long ago. The foremost of the flyers was Domhnaill himself, running for dear life up the long slope of the pass. He was alone now and on foot. One horse after another had fallen under him, and of all the army he had led out to its ruin, not one was there to stand by him. This man had come between him and the spear that threatened him, that one had turned back to keep the hunters in play. They were gone now, but he was still a king, if the crown on his helmet could make him one, and he bethought him of hiding among the moors and rocks, anywhere like a wild beast, and he peered this way and that, through the rain as he ran, with none following. Escaped, he hoped, at last. He neared the brow of the hill. Soon it would be down bank and away. Surely some woodland dweller would harbour him. Under a hawthorn tree at the summit sat a woman, with long golden hair lank in the rain, and green gown wet and clinging to her sides. Hard-featured and fierce she looked. Strange as she rose and stood before him in the way, He dashed at her blindly with his sword, but she caught his hand, and as he stumbled at her feet the crown fell from his helmet, clattering on the stones of the path. She took it up and weighed it in her hand. "Domhnaill," she said, "it is mine at last then." "Oh, Aluinn," he cried, "save me, hide me." She led him by a roaring stream and up a steep narrow gill, away from the valley and the shouts of the pursuers, aloft into the cloud. It was but a step, and they came to a black water, shoreless beyond for the rain mist. As he sank down, outwearied, she flung the golden thing into the dark tarn. "It is safe there," she said. And there they say the crown of Cumbria lies to this hour, in the depths of Grizedale tarn. Domhnaill passed away into the cloud, and was seen no more in these parts. Folk might well believe him to be dead or gone to fairyland. Whether his flight was spied by some of the Northmen coming over Dunmail Raise towards the Althing which they never held, or howsoever it might have been told, the place kept his name, changed but a little in alien mouths, and still haunted, they say, by the fleeing king and the fairy maid flitting before him. Chapter 50. The Peace of Thorstein. Terrible was the tale they brought to Hågan about the storm of the Lorberg and the death of Thorstein and his fellows, though indeed not all of them perished. Hopeless as it seemed, some of that band had cut their way through the Saxon army and escaped into hiding among the rocks and woods on Brackmere bank, and some that had been left for dead had been found by their friends when the storm was over, and taken up and healed of their wounds. But not Thorstein. He lay where he fell, within a step of the spot where he had slain his brother. They gave him his peace, late as it was, for it was not too late to let his children inherit the land he had taken around Thurston Water. Hundi and Raud, Mani and the rest of their kinsmen and neighbours, came together and rebuilt the homestead at Blawith, freely giving their labour as the custom was. And over and above their labour, each comer gave a share toward the things that were needed to keep house and farm, so that with what she had and what she got, Raniach lacked neither servants nor stock, furniture within nor gear without. They brought her from the island, and bade her dwell in peace on the land that was hers and her children's. Many a time came to her one and another who would gladly have cast in his lot with them for her sake, but she said nay to all. After a while she sent for a priest, and built him a church at Blawith, that she might bring up her household in the right faith and fear of God. And before Yule she was the mother of a third son to Thorstein, whom she called Cartney after her father, for he was red-haired and long-limbed. "Thorstein of the Mere will not want for sons to avenge him," said folk when they came to see her. "Nay," she said, "he has found his peace. Let us keep it." But a 12-month had not gone by after the battle, and midsummer was not yet come, when they heard tidings of the death of Edmund in his own hall at a feast by the hands of an outlaw. The Northfolk looked at one another, as much as to say it was but his due. Vengeance had come upon him already for the strife he had stirred up, and especially for the sackless and innocent men who had fallen with Thorstein Sweinson in the war upon Cumberland. But the Northmen continued in their homes, by firth and fell, spite of York earls and Scottish kings. For yet 100 years and more they kept their freedom. Their own laws they made at their Althing, now in one spot, now in another, shifted westward, maybe, to Little Langdale after Thored's ravaging of Westmorland, and southward after Ethelred's harrying of Cumberland. Even when the Normans had brought all this border country under the feudal yoke, still for many 100 years the Dalesmen, children of the Vikings, used to meet at the Steading Stone by Thirlmere Wath, and kept alive some smouldering memory of their birthright in the country penalties of Withburn. And everywhere they still have their old manners and their old speech, changing little of either, and that but slowly. The Blawith house endured, its children lived long in the land. When they increased so that Blawith was too small for them, across the Crake they built a strong place, and called it the New Burg, and the ground that it stood in, Newberthwaite. Neighbours by-named them the Redheads of Nibthwaite, maybe because they took after their kinsmen of the fells. There they dwelt, a great family, for many a generation, and thereabouts they dwell even to this day. For in these dales the dream of Unna came true, that saw love abiding and labour continuing, heedless of glory and fearless of death. So ends the story of Thorstein. End of Thorstein of the Mere by W. G. Collingwood.